There is an island off the southern coast of Nova Scotia that has been asking the same question for more than 200 years. It is a small island, unremarkable in shape, covered in oak and birch and red spruce. It sits in Mahone Bay among dozens of similar islands, most of them ignored by history. But Oak Island was not ignored. Oak Island was found. In 1795, a teenager named Daniel McGinnis rode to the island alone. The reasons vary depending on which account you trust. Some say he was exploring, others say he noticed something from the mainland, a light perhaps, or a clearing that should not have been there. What is consistent across every early retelling is what he found when he arrived in a small clearing on the island's southeast end. The ground was depressed in a circular shape, roughly 13 feet across. The soil had sunk as though something beneath it had collapsed or settled over time. Directly above the depression, an old oak tree extended a thick limb from which hung a weathered ship's tackle block, the kind used aboard sailing vessels to hoist heavy cargo. The branch showed deep scarring from ropes or chains. The tree was old. The clearing around it had been deliberately cut. Someone had been here before. Someone with equipment. Someone with purpose. McGinnis returned with two companions, John Smith and Anthony Vaughn, and the three young men began to dig. What they uncovered in those first few feet would set off a chain of excavation attempts spanning centuries, but the very first detail is the one most people pass over too quickly. A ship's tackle block requires a ship, and no ship was logged anywhere near Oak Island in any Nova Scotian port record for the years surrounding the discovery. No merchant vessel, no military supply run, no fishing operation large enough to carry hoisting equipment. Whoever hung that tackle from that tree came and went without appearing in a single official record. That absence is not a gap. It is the first clue. The three boys dug with borrowed tools and the kind of urgency that only comes from believing something valuable is just a few feet below. At 2 feet down, they struck a layer of flagstone. It was not native to Oak Island. Someone had placed it there deliberately, a sealed cap over whatever lay beneath. They removed it and kept digging. At 10 feet, they hit a platform of oak logs wedged tightly into the walls of the shaft, yet fitted edge to edge like the floor of a cabin. They pried the logs loose, expecting to find a chamber below. Instead, they found more earth. They kept going. At 20 feet, another platform of oak logs. At 30 feet, a third. Each layer was identical in construction. Each had been placed with care and effort, requiring not just labor but planning. The walls of the shaft showed pick marks in hard clay, evidence of skilled excavation. This was not the work of one man in a single afternoon. It was engineering, structured, repetitive, designed with the expectation that someone would eventually dig down and encounter these layers one by one. The boys could go no further without equipment and manpower they did not have. They stopped at 30 feet and left the island, convinced they had found a treasure vault. But even at this early stage, the pit was already contradicting simple explanations. Pirate treasure is buried to be retrieved quickly and discreetly. You do not build 10-foot intervals of reinforced oak platforms over a cache you plan to dig up next season. Whoever built this shaft expected it to remain sealed, perhaps for years, perhaps for generations. The pit was not just a hiding place, it was architecture. And architecture always implies intent that outlasts the builder. The question was no longer what was buried beneath Oak Island. The question was who would bury something this carefully and then never come back for it. Here is a detail that most people skip because it complicates a narrative they have already decided to believe. The Oak Island discovery of 1795 was not written down in 1795. Though the earliest known published account of the McGinnis discovery did not appear until 1857, more than 60 years after the event supposedly took place. Before that, the story circulated orally among families in the Mahone Bay area, passed from fathers to sons, from neighbors to newcomers, with the inevitable distortion that accompanies any story told by memory across decades. There is no diary entry from Daniel McGinnis, no letter from John Smith or Anthony Vaughan describing what they saw, no newspaper notice from 1795 or 1796 or any year in the decade following. The first written record that historians can verify is a brief mention in a Liverpool, Nova Scotia newspaper published in the middle of the 19th century. And even that account contains inconsistencies with later versions. The flagstone at 2 feet, for example, does not appear in every telling. Some versions add a layer of charcoal, others include coconut fiber at the 10-foot mark, detail that more likely belongs to an excavation conducted 50 years later. None of this means the story is false, but it means the foundation of everything that follows is not bedrock. It is oral tradition shaped by repetition, interpretation, and the desires of those doing the telling. What is harder to dismiss is what happened next. In 1849, a formal company was organized and financed to excavate the pit. Investors put up real money, equipment was transported to the island, engineers were consulted. This was not a venture launched on rumor alone. Someone, somewhere, had information compelling enough to attract organized capital at a time when such investment was not made lightly. If the original story was embellished or even partially invented, then something else must have been driving the effort, something that has never been made public. The pit had a past before Daniel McGinnis. It is just that nobody wrote it down. By 1803, the first organized excavation company had formed. The Onslow Company arrived with proper tools, experienced diggers, and enough capital to push past the 30-foot mark where McGinnis and his companions had been forced to stop. They dug through more oak platforms. They found layers of charcoal, then putty, then coconut fiber. Each material was foreign to the island. Each had been deliberately placed. At approximately 90 feet, the crew reportedly struck a large flat stone unlike anything else in the shaft. It was smooth, dark, and inscribed on one side with a series of symbols that no one present could read. The stone was removed from the pit and brought to the surface. For years afterward, it was displayed in a Halifax bookbinder's shop, propped in a window like a curiosity. Visitors came to look at it. Some attempted to decipher the markings. The most widely circulated translation, which did not appear until 1866, claims the inscription read 40 feet below 2 million pounds are buried. This translation is almost certainly a fabrication. It appeared conveniently during a period when new investors were being courted for yet another excavation attempt. But the existence of the stone itself is harder to dismiss. Multiple witnesses from the Onslow Company expedition described it independently. The material was not native to Nova Scotia. The markings were consistent across reports, and then at some point in the late 19th century, the stone vanished. No photograph exists, no rubbing, no wax impression. The single most important artifact ever recovered from the Oak Island pit disappeared from the historical record without explanation. Either it was lost through negligence, which seems unlikely for an object of such obvious significance, or it was deliberately removed by someone who did not want the inscription to be studied further. A stone that speaks is dangerous. A stone that disappears is more dangerous still. And whoever took it understood that silence properly maintained across generations, is more effective than any lock ever built. The day after the inscribed stone was removed, the Onslow Company lowered a crew back into the shaft, expecting to break through into whatever chamber lay below. They had pushed past every obstacle. 90 feet of layered engineering had been dismantled. Whatever was hidden beneath the island seemed for the first time within reach. Then the water came. Overnight, seawater flooded the pit to a depth of approximately 60 feet. The crew attempted to bail it out. They worked in shifts with buckets and pumps. The water level did not drop. It held steady, rising and falling not with rainfall, but with the ocean tide. The pit was breathing with the Atlantic. Later, investigators would discover what appeared to be the mechanism responsible. At Smith's Cove, roughly 500 feet from the money pit, an elaborate drainage system had been constructed beneath the beach. Used layers of coconut fiber and eelgrass covered a network of hand-laid stone channels that funneled seawater into at least one tunnel running directly to the pit. When the excavation breached a certain depth, it broke the seal on this tunnel, and the ocean poured in. The engineering was precise. The materials were deliberate. The coconut fiber acted as a filter to prevent sediment from clogging the channels over time. The stonework was angled to maintain flow rate. This was not an accident of geology. This was a booby trap. Whoever built the money pit had designed it to self-destruct the moment anyone dug deep enough to approach its contents. The flood system required skills in hydraulic engineering, surveying, and underground construction that were not common in colonial Nova Scotia. The nearest parallel in complexity would be found in European military fortifications or in the mining operations of experienced engineers familiar with water management in deep excavation. Somebody built a vault beneath an island and then built the ocean into its lock, and the key, if there ever was one, was not left behind. It departed with the builders, and no one since has been able to forge a replacement. It would be easy to dismiss the flood tunnel theory as exaggeration if not for the physical evidence pulled from Smith's Cove. Beneath the beach, workers in the mid-19th century uncovered thick mats of coconut fiber interwoven with eelgrass, compressed into dense layers and spread across a wide area. Below the fiber, 5 stone-lined box drains converged into a single channel aimed directly at the money pit. The coconut fiber is the detail that resists every simple explanation. Coconut palms do not grow in Nova Scotia. They do not grow anywhere in northeastern North America. The nearest natural source would be the Caribbean, the west coast of Africa, or the coastal regions of the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia. Someone transported this material across an ocean and packed it into an underground drainage system on a small uninhabited island in Mahone Bay. This was not a handful of fibers. Estimates suggest several tons of coconut husk material were used in the Smith's Cove construction alone. Moving that quantity of organic material required a ship, a crew, and a supply chain that connected Oak Island to the tropics or to a maritime network operating across hemispheres. Carbon dating has been applied to samples of the coconut fiber over the years, and the results have not simplified matters. Some tests returned dates in the early 17th century, which would be consistent with colonial era activity. But other samples have been dated to the 15th century, and at least one test returned results suggesting the material was placed on the island before any widely accepted European contact with the region. If the earlier dates are accurate, the builders were operating in Nova Scotia before Columbus reached the Caribbean. If the later dates are accurate, the builders had access to tropical supply lines during a period when very few organizations maintained global maritime logistics. In either case, the coconut fiber does not belong. and whatever does not belong demands an explanation that no one has yet been able to provide. To understand what might be buried beneath Oak Island, it is necessary to travel 6,000 miles east and 700 years into the past. In 1119, a French nobleman named Hugues de Payens and 8 companions presented themselves before King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. They proposed the formation of a monastic military order dedicated to the protection of Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. The king granted them quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which sat directly atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple on the Temple Mount. The order called itself the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History would call them the Knights Templar. For the first 9 years of the order's existence, something unusual happened, or rather, something unusual did not happen. The Templars recruited no new members. 9 men living in one of the most strategically important locations in the Christian world, sworn to protect thousands of pilgrims on dangerous roads, and they did not seek a single additional knight for nearly a decade. Contemporary accounts suggest the 9 original members spent much of their time not on patrol, but beneath their quarters, excavating the subterranean chambers and tunnels under the Temple Mount. Crusader-era texts make passing references to Templar digging activity, but offer no detail as to what was being sought or what was found. The silence is striking. These were men embedded in a society that documented religious missions obsessively, yet no Templar chronicle describes the excavation. No inventory of findings was ever produced, for no report was filed with the church. What is documented, however, is the result. Within a single generation, after those first 9 years, the Knights Templar became the wealthiest and most powerful non-governmental organization in the Western world. Their rise was not gradual, it was explosive. Land, gold, political influence, and papal favor arrived almost simultaneously, as if some fundamental shift in the order's value had occurred. What they found beneath the Temple Mount was never declared, and no one who should have asked ever did. Within decades of their founding, the Templars controlled an empire that rivaled most European monarchies. They invented modern banking, allowing pilgrims to deposit funds in one country and withdraw equivalent value in another using coded receipts. Their network spanned England, France, Spain, Portugal, in the German states, and the Levant. They held thousands of properties. They built castles, churches, and commanderies across the continent, and they constructed some of the most extraordinary Gothic cathedrals in European history, structures whose geometry and proportions still puzzle architectural historians who wonder how a military order acquired such advanced mathematical and engineering knowledge. But one element of Templar infrastructure receives less attention than it deserves. The fleet. Operating primarily out of the French Atlantic port of La Rochelle, the Templars maintained a substantial navy. Their ships moved personnel, cargo, and currency across the Mediterranean and along the Atlantic coast. Yet the full scope of their maritime operations was never documented in any surviving Templar record. The port logs from the period reference unnamed Templar vessels arriving and departing with sealed cargo. Some records note ships heading not south toward the Mediterranean, but west into open Atlantic waters with no declared destination. A military religious order does not build a navy for spiritual reasons. Ships cost money. They require harbors, supply chains, crews, and a reason to exist. The Templar fleet was large enough to be noticed by port authorities across multiple countries, and yet quiet enough that its full operational range was never officially mapped. What were they moving? Where were they taking it? And why does no Templar document that has ever been recovered mention what the fleet carried on its westward voyages. Some silences are the result of lost records. Others are the result of records that were never meant to exist. The unit of the fleet moved in silence because silence was the design, not the accident. On October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France executed one of the most coordinated acts of political violence in medieval history. At dawn, sealed arrest warrants were opened simultaneously across the country. Templar properties were raided. Knights, sergeants, and servants of the order were seized, chained, and transported to royal prisons. The charges were heresy, blasphemy, and obscene rituals. Under torture, many confessed. The trials that followed were a formality. The outcome had been decided before the first warrant was unsealed. Philip owed the Templars an enormous financial debt. The order's wealth threatened royal sovereignty. By destroying the Templars, he eliminated his creditors and seized their French assets in a single coordinated strike. But there is a problem with the narrative of total destruction. When royal agents entered the Paris Temple, the central treasury of the entire order, they found it empty, not depleted, not partially cleared, empty. The vaults that had held the accumulated wealth of one of the richest organizations in Christendom contained nothing. Someone had moved the treasury before the arrests. More troubling still, the Templar fleet at La Rochelle had departed days before October 13th. Multiple port witnesses confirmed that ships sailed under Templar flags in the first week of October. Their destination was not logged, their cargo was not inventoried, and no port in France, Portugal, Scotland, or anywhere in the Mediterranean ever recorded their arrival. An entire fleet vanished. Philip's agents searched for years. The Vatican launched inquiries. Not a single Templar ship was ever recovered, captured, or confirmed to have docked at any known harbor after the first week of October 1307. This is not a legend. It is a documented gap in the historical record that no one has been able to close. The Templars had advance warning, they had time to act, and whatever they carried out of France on those ships has never been found. The fleet sailed west into the Atlantic and then, as far as the official record is concerned, into silence. The number most commonly cited is 18. 18 Templar vessels departed La Rochelle in the days before the mass arrest, loaded with cargo that had been moved from the Paris Temple and other regional treasuries under cover of routine transfers. This was not a panicked evacuation. In the logistics of moving heavy cargo from inland vaults to a coastal port, unloading it onto ships, and departing before royal agents arrived, suggests planning that began weeks or months in advance. Someone inside the French court had warned the order. The identity of that source has never been established. What followed was a disappearance so thorough that it still haunts historians. A few Templar ships appeared briefly in Scottish waters. Scotland, under Robert the Bruce, had been excommunicated by the Pope and was not enforcing the Templar suppression order. It was the one kingdom in Europe where Templars could land without being arrested. Accounts from the period suggest Templar knights fought alongside the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, though the evidence is debated. But even if some ships reach Scotland, they do not account for the full fleet. No harbor in Scotland recorded receiving the volume of cargo that left La Rochelle. No inventory of Templar wealth was ever filed with the Scottish crown, and several of the ships that departed France were never seen again in any European port. The simplest explanation is that they sank. The Atlantic is unforgiving, and medieval vessels were vulnerable to storms. But 18 ships do not all sink in the same storm without leaving wreckage on some coastline. The more uncomfortable explanation is that they reached a destination that was not in Europe, a destination that did not appear on any official map of the time. a destination that 700 years later might still be keeping its secret. If the Templar fleet, or any part of it, reached Scotland, then the question becomes what happened next. And the answer leads to one of the most controversial families in the story of Oak Island. The Sinclairs of Rosslyn were Scottish nobility with deep Templar connections. After the dissolution of the order in 1312, Templar lands and assets in Scotland were nominally transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, but many properties remained under Sinclair control. The family served as hereditary guardians of Templar legacy in Scotland, a role that was both political and, according to some historians, custodial. In the 1390s, roughly 80 years after the Templar suppression, a Venetian document known as the Zeno Narrative surfaced. It describes a series of North Atlantic voyages undertaken by members of the Zeno family in the company of a northern prince referred to as Zichmni, a figure many researchers have identified as Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney. The narrative describes landings in places that correspond geographically to the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and a landmass to the west that bears a striking resemblance to Nova Scotia. The Zeno map, which accompanies the narrative, is where the story becomes genuinely unsettling. Published in 1558, the map contains geographic details of the North Atlantic coastline that were not officially charted until the 16th century. Islands are positioned with a degree of accuracy that would require first-hand observation. Coastal features match Nova Scotian topography in ways that are difficult to attribute to guesswork. If the map is genuine, it suggests that someone traveled to Nova Scotia a full century before Columbus crossed the Atlantic and documented the journey with a precision that implies repeated contact, not a single accidental landing. Critics argue that the Zeno narrative is a later fabrication, embellished or invented by descendants for political prestige, but the map's geographic accuracy remains unexplained. And if Henry Sinclair, heir to the Templar custodial tradition, did reach Nova Scotia in the 14th century, the question is not just whether he explored the coast. The question is whether he left something behind or buried it. Rosslyn Chapel sits a few miles south of Edinburgh, built between 1446 and 1484 by Sir William Sinclair, a direct descendant of the family that had sheltered Templar interests in Scotland for over a century. The chapel is small but extraordinarily ornate. Every surface is carved, every column tells a story, and at least two of those stories should not be possible. Among the hundreds of botanical carvings that decorate the chapel's interior, researchers have identified what appear to be ears of maize and leaves of the aloe plant. Maize is native to the Americas. Aloe is a plant of the tropics and subtropics. Neither existed in Scotland in the 15th century. Neither was known to European botanists until well after Columbus returned from his first voyage in 1493. The Rosslyn carvings were executed decades before that date. Conventional explanations have been offered. Some art historians argue the carvings represent stylized wheat or local plants. Others suggest they were added during later restorations, but the carvings are integrated into the original stonework. They are not additions. They are not afterthoughts. They were designed as part of the chapel's iconographic program from the beginning. If the Sinclairs had access to New World plants before the rest of Europe, they obtained them through voyages that are not part of the accepted historical timeline. The carvings do not prove that the Sinclairs reached North America, but they suggest contact with materials that could only have come from across the Atlantic. And here's the gap that no one has closed. The Sinclairs inherited Templar knowledge. They may have inherited Templar roots. The carvings suggest they brought something back from wherever those routes led, but carvings are declarations. They show what was found. They do not show what was left behind. If the Sinclairs traveled to Nova Scotia, Rosslyn tells us they returned. It does not tell us what stayed. Before Daniel McGinnis set foot on Oak Island in 1795, the island had no permanent residents, no homestead, no registered occupant. In a region where land grants were carefully documented by the British colonial administration, Oak Island existed an administrative blank. This would be unremarkable if the island showed no signs of human activity, but it did. Land surveys conducted in the 1760s, more than 30 years before the McGinnis discovery, reveal features on Oak Island that are inconsistent with undisturbed terrain. There were clearings where no settlement was recorded, cart paths running from the shoreline into the island's interior, stone markers placed at irregular intervals. None of this was attributed to any known operation, military, commercial, or agricultural. The surveys recorded the features but offered no explanation for their presence. More troubling is what the colonial archives do not contain. The Nova Scotia's land records for the Mahone Bay region are remarkably thorough for the 17th and 18th centuries. Property transfers, timber rights, fishing claims, and military land grants are documented in detail. But for Oak Island, there is a gap. Between approximately 1620 and 1750, no deed, claim, lease, or official mention of Oak Island appears in the Nova Scotia colonial record. This is the period during which, based on the engineering evidence, the Money Pit and its flood tunnels would have been constructed. Someone was on the island during those missing decades. The physical evidence proves it, but the documentary record is silent, as if the island were deliberately excluded from the administrative systems that tracked every other piece of land in the bay. Gaps in archives happen. Records are lost to fire, flood, and neglect. But a gap that aligns precisely with the construction window of one of the most engineered underground structures in the Western Hemisphere is not a coincidence. It is a signature. Someone operated on Oak Island for over a century and left no name, no claim, and no trace in any official document. That takes more than luck. That takes intent. The Mi'kmaq people have lived in Nova Scotia for thousands of years. Their oral traditions are not folklore. They are a historical record maintained through structured storytelling, passed from generation to generation with the kind of discipline that literate societies invest in written documents. And the Mi'kmaq remember something about Oak Island that predates Daniel McGinnis by at least a generation. Elders in the Mahone Bay region have recounted stories of strange activity on the island long before the 1795 discovery. The descriptions are consistent across multiple accounts. Fires were seen on the island at night, visible from the mainland. Men were observed digging after dark. Boats came and went at unusual hours. The Mi'kmaq did not approach, they did not interfere, but they watched and they remembered. What makes these accounts significant is not just their content, but their timing. The Mi'kmaq descriptions of nighttime activity on Oak Island correspond to a period well before any British or French colonial operation was documented in the area. The workers described in these oral traditions do not match known military or commercial activity. No logging crew, no fishing camp. No military garrison operated on Oak Island during the period the Mi'kmaq accounts describe. The men who dug at night came from somewhere else. They worked in secrecy, and they left before the colonial period generated enough bureaucratic machinery to record their presence. Oral traditions are sometimes dismissed by historians trained in documentary evidence. But the Mi'kmaq had no motive to invent stories about strangers digging on an island they themselves did not use. Their accounts are observational. not mythological. They describe what was seen, not what was believed, and what was seen was a group of unidentified people engaged in large-scale excavation on an island that, according to every colonial record, was supposed to be empty. Someone was there. The Mi'kmaq knew it. They just did not know who. Maps lie, not always deliberately, but often enough that cartographic historians treat every old chart as a document that must be read with suspicion. Coastlines shift, names migrate, errors are copied from one map to the next for centuries, but sometimes what a map conceals is more revealing than what it shows. French and Portuguese maps from the early 16th century chart the coast of Nova Scotia with varying degrees of accuracy. Most place Mahone Bay in approximately the correct position relative to Halifax and the La Have River. This is not unusual. European ships had been fishing the Grand Banks and exploring the coast since the late 1400s. What is unusual is the level of precision with which certain maps mark the bay itself. And at least two charts from this period annotate the Mahone Bay area with notations that are either illegible or have been deliberately obscured. In one case, the original text appears to have been scraped from the vellum and overwritten with a generic coastal label. In another, ink has been applied over an earlier inscription in a heavier hand, rendering the original unreadable. Cartographic alteration is not uncommon in this period. Maps were military intelligence. Knowing where safe harbors existed, where fresh water was available, and where enemy fortifications stood was a matter of strategic survival. If someone wanted to conceal the significance of a particular location, altering the map was the most efficient method. What is unsettling is not that these maps were changed. It is that the changes were targeted. The surrounding coastline was left intact. Only the Mahone Bay annotations were affected. Only the area around Oak Island was erased. A map maker corrects errors across an entire chart. A sensor targets a specific location. The distinction matters, and in the silence where those annotations once existed, the same question returns. Who knew about Mahone Bay before it was supposed to be known, and who made certain that knowledge did not survive? By 1849, the flooding of the Money Pit had defeated every attempt at open excavation. A new approach was needed. The Truro Company, the latest group of investors to stake their fortunes on Oak Island, decided to drill. If they could not dig through the water, they would bore through whatever lay at the bottom and pull up samples. And the drill was lowered past the flood level and driven deep into the earth beneath the pit. At approximately 98 feet, the bit passed through a spruce platform. Then it struck something the drillers described as loose metal, pieces of something that shifted and clinked against the boring tool. Below the metal, another layer of oak, below the oak, a material that the operator identified by texture and appearance as parchment. A small fragment was brought to the surface. It appeared to be sheepskin with traces of ink. One witness described what looked like a Roman letter inscribed on its surface. The fragment was handled by multiple members of the Truro Company. It was discussed, it was examined, and then it disappeared. No museum holds it. No private collection has ever confirmed possession of it. The single most potentially significant artifact ever extracted from the Money Pit, a fragment of parchment that could have been dated, analyzed for ink composition, and potentially translated, simply ceased to exist. The drill had also brought up what was described as links of a gold chain, though this claim is contested and no physical sample survives for verification. What does survive is the testimony of the workers who operated the drill. They felt the bit pass through structured layers. They heard metal. They recovered organic material with writing on it. and then every physical trace of what they found was lost, not over centuries, over months, as though someone understood exactly what had been brought to the surface and ensured it could never be studied. In the decades following the Truro Company's drilling campaign, in very subsequent expeditions pushed deeper. New shafts were sunk alongside the original pit in an attempt to tunnel laterally beneath the flood level and reach whatever chamber lay at the bottom. Most of these shafts flooded as well, suggesting the tunnel system was more extensive than anyone had initially assumed. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, deeper drilling operations reported encountering something unexpected at approximately 153 feet below the surface. The drill bit struck a layer of what operators described as cement or concrete, a material that should not exist at that depth in natural Nova Scotian geology. Core samples brought to the surface contained fragments of a substance that, when analyzed, appeared to be a deliberately mixed compound, calcium-based, with aggregate material embedded in it, consistent with a rudimentary but effective hydraulic cement. Below this layer, the drill encountered a void, a space where the bit met no resistance. The implication was staggering. Someone had constructed a sealed chamber deep underground, capped it with a cement barrier, and left it intact beneath over 150 feet of earth, water, and engineered obstructions. The cement itself raised as many questions as it answered. Hydraulic cement, the kind that hardens underwater, was known in the ancient world. The Romans used it extensively. Certain medieval builders had access to similar formulations, but its presence on a small island in the North Atlantic at a depth that required extraordinary engineering to reach did not match any known colonial construction project. There's no military fortification in Nova Scotia used cement at that depth. No civilian building project required it. Whatever was sealed inside that chamber was sealed by people who intended it to remain closed, not for decades, but for centuries. The vault has never been breached. No expedition, despite 200 years of effort, has successfully opened the chamber or confirmed its contents. It sits beneath the water table, behind flood tunnels under layers of oak and stone and imported soil, and it waits. The builders knew that patience would be the vault's greatest defense. They were right. Oak Island has killed 6 people. This is not metaphor. 6 men have died in various excavation attempts since the search began in 1861. A boiler explosion during a pumping operation killed 1 worker. In 1897, a man fell to his death in one of the shafts. The most devastating single incident occurred in 1965 when 4 men, Robert Restall, his son Robert Jr., Carl Gracer, and Cyril Hiltz, died in rapid succession. Restall descended into a shaft and was overcome by what was likely hydrogen sulfide gas, a colorless toxic vapor that accumulates in enclosed underground spaces. His son went down after him, then Grazer, then Hiltz. Each man tried to save the one before him. Each one died. The island does not discriminate. It takes the curious and the cautious alike. And woven through the local folklore of Mahone Bay is a persistent legend that Oak Island will not surrender its secret until 7 people have died in the search. 6 have died, the 7th has not. Whether this is superstition, coincidence, or a darker kind of pattern, yet it is hung over every subsequent expedition. No one laughs at it on the island, but the deaths also raise a more practical question. The engineering of the money pit was not merely designed to conceal the flood tunnels, the gas pockets, the structural instability caused by over 2 centuries of failed excavations. These features make the pit it's actively dangerous. The builders may not have intended to kill anyone specifically, but they clearly intended to make unauthorized retrieval so difficult that most attempts would fail and some would prove fatal. There is a meaningful difference between a vault and a trap. A vault protects its contents and allows authorized access. A trap protects its contents by ensuring that access itself is the punishment. After 6 deaths and no successful recovery, the evidence suggests that the money pit may be closer to the latter, and whoever built it understood the difference perfectly. It is time to say something uncomfortable about the Templar theory. It is elegant. It is seductive. It connects a medieval mystery to a modern one with a kind of narrative symmetry that makes for compelling television and best-selling books. A persecuted order flees Europe with its secret treasure, sails across the Atlantic using routes charted decades earlier by allied Scottish nobility, and buries its most sacred possessions beneath a small island in Nova Scotia, protected by engineering so advanced that no one has been able to crack it in over 200 years. It is a beautiful story, but beauty is not evidence. And the truth is that no Templar artifact has ever been recovered from Oak Island. No seal, no coin, no sword hilt, no inscription bearing the Templar cross or any symbol associated with the order. 2 centuries of excavation have produced fragments of parchment, traces of gold chain, coconut fiber, foreign soil, and an inscribed stone that no longer exists. None of these items carry a Templar signature. The coconut fiber could have come from any maritime operation with tropical connections. The engineering could have been executed by any group with advanced construction knowledge. The flood tunnels are impressive, but they are not uniquely Templar. What the Templar theory has going for it is not physical evidence. It is the absence of a better explanation. The oak platforms, the hydraulic cement, the drainage system, the depth, the secrecy, these features demand a builder with resources, knowledge, global reach, and a reason for absolute concealment. The Templars fit that profile. But fitting a profile is not the same as leaving a fingerprint. And here is the detail that keeps the theory alive despite its evidentiary weakness. The absence of identifying marks may itself be evidence. If the builders were members of a dissolved and persecuted order, leaving any identifying trace would have invited the very destruction they were trying to escape. The absence of Templar evidence on Oak Island is exactly what you would expect if the Templars built it. And that paradox is what makes the theory so difficult to either prove or abandon. The Templars are not the only candidates. Over the decades, researchers have proposed a long list of alternative builders, each with partial evidence and fatal gaps. Francis Bacon, the English statesman and philosopher, has been championed by those who believe the pit contains original manuscripts, proving he authored the works attributed to William Shakespeare. Proponents point to Bacon's known interest in ciphers and concealment, but no manuscript fragment recovered from Oak Island has been attributed to Bacon, and the engineering of the pit far exceeds what any single Elizabethan intellectual could have organized. Captain William Kidd, the privateer, has been proposed as the treasure's source. Kidd operated in the Atlantic and was known to bury caches of loot. But Kidd's resources were modest compared to the engineering evident in the pit, and his operational period in the late 1600s does not align well with the earlier carbon dating of materials found on the island. Others have suggested the French crown jewels, spirited out of Fortress Louisbourg during the Acadian conflicts, or a British military payroll lost during the American Revolution, or a Catholic reliquary hidden during the religious upheavals of the Reformation. Each theory accounts for one or two of the anomalies, the tropical materials, the advanced construction, the secrecy, the missing records, But no single alternative theory accounts for all of them simultaneously. The coconut fiber points to a global maritime operation. The engineering points to institutional level resources. The absence of records points to deliberate erasure, and the depth, complexity, and self defending nature of the vault point to builders who considered what they were hiding worth more than the lives of anyone who came looking. Most treasure is hidden to be recovered. The Oak Island Vault was built to remain sealed. Now, that distinction eliminates most candidates and leaves only those who had something they believed must never be found by the wrong hands. There is a question that most Oak Island researchers avoid because it undermines the economic logic of every expedition. What if the money pit does not contain money? What if it was never built to store gold, silver, jewels, or any form of material wealth? What if the thing buried beneath Oak Island is not a treasure, but a secret? Consider the engineering from the perspective of purpose. If you were hiding gold, you would want to retrieve it eventually. You would build a vault with a mechanism for access. Difficult, perhaps, but not impossible. You would leave instructions with trusted allies. You would design the system to open. The money pit was not designed to open. It was designed to remain closed. The flood tunnels ensure that any excavation deep enough to reach the chamber will be destroyed by seawater. The gas pockets punish anyone who finds a way around the water. The depth itself places the contents beyond the reach of any technology available to the builders' contemporaries. This is not how you store wealth. This is how you bury a document, a relic, a piece of knowledge that someone believed was more dangerous in the open than it was underground. If the Templars or whoever built the pit were in possession of something that could destabilize a throne, a church, or an entire system of belief, then the engineering, it makes perfect sense. You do not build a 200-year puzzle box for gold. Gold can be spent. Gold can be melted. Gold is only gold. But a document that proves the wrong thing, a relic that rewrites the past, a secret that changes who holds power and why, that is worth defending with the kind of obsessive permanence that Oak Island represents. The most valuable thing in the pit may not be something you can hold. It may be something you can know. And if that is the case, the real question is not what is buried beneath Oak Island. The real question is what someone learned that was so dangerous it had to be removed from the world entirely. In 1897, a survey of Oak Island's surface features identified a large stone triangle on the south shore. 3 carefully placed boulders formed a perfect isosceles triangle with one vertex aligned precisely to true north. The stones were not glacial erratics, deposited randomly by ice. They had been positioned deliberately, set into the ground at angles that required human effort and geometric knowledge. The triangle pointed inland. Its axis, when extended, passed directly through the location of the money pit. Decades later, a surveyor and treasure hunter named Fred Nolan spent years mapping the island and discovered a second formation. 5 large cone-shaped boulders were arranged in the shape of a cross, each one placed at a distance from the others that corresponded to specific measurements. Nolan called it the Nolan Cross. It was oriented on a north-south axis, and its proportions were not arbitrary. The distances between the stones matched units of measurement found in Templar and Masonic construction, specifically the ancient unit known as the megalithic yard, a measurement that predates the metric system by millennia and has been identified in stone circles, cathedrals, and sacred architecture across Europe and the British Isles. The stone triangle and the Nolan Cross are not inside the money pit. They are on the surface. visible to anyone who walks the island with a surveyor's eye. Their alignment with each other and with the pit suggests they are part of a single coordinated design, a system of markers laid out before or during the construction of the underground works. This implies a builder who thought not just in terms of depth, but in terms of landscape, someone who used the island itself as a component of the design. And yet no surveyor's plan, no construction blueprint, no written schematic connecting these features has ever been found. The geometry exists. The intent behind it is visible, but the author of the design remains unnamed, and the full meaning of the pattern has never been decoded. The proportions of the Oak Island surface features become more uncomfortable when compared to one specific source. The first book of Kings in the Old Testament provides detailed measurements for Solomon's temple, the structure beneath which the original 9 Templars spent nearly a decade excavating. The temple's dimensions, its inner sanctum, its pillars, its courts are described in cubits, and those measurements have been analyzed by architects and theologians for centuries. When researchers applied the cubit measurements from the biblical description of Solomon's temple to the distances between the Nolan Cross boulders, the stone triangle, and the money pit, they found correspondences that are difficult to attribute to coincidence. The distance between certain markers on Oak Island matches within a margin of inches the dimensions described for the temple's Holy of Holies. The alignment of the stone triangle mirrors the orientation of the temple's entrance relative to the compass. The Nolan Cross approximates the proportional layout of the temple's inner chambers. This is either one of the most remarkable coincidences in archaeological history, or evidence that the builders of Oak Island's surface features were working from the same architectural template that governed the design of Solomon's temple. The implication is significant. If the builders encoded Solomonic geometry into the landscape of Oak Island, they were almost certainly drawing on knowledge associated with the Temple Mount. And the one organization in Western history most directly connected to the excavation of the Temple Mount is the Knights Templar. Critics rightly note that this analysis has been conducted by researchers who were already looking for a Templar connection. The human mind is skilled at finding patterns where none exist, especially when it wants to find them, but the precision of the measurements is not easily dismissed, and the question remains open. If the geometry is intentional, then the builders of Oak Island were not just hiding something, they were encoding its meaning into the earth itself, leaving a message for anyone who knew how to read the landscape. The question is whether anyone still can. There is a possibility that researchers have been looking at Oak Island the wrong way. For 2 centuries, the focus has been downward. Every expedition drills deeper, digs further, and tries to reach whatever sits at the bottom of the money pit. But what if the most important information on Oak Island is not below the surface? What if it is the surface? The stone triangle, the Nolan Cross, the alignments with the pit, the clearing where McGinnis found the depression, the cart paths recorded in pre-colonial surveys. Taken individually, each feature is an anomaly. Taken together, they form a layout, a spatial arrangement that suggests the island itself was designed to be read, not as land, but as a document. If the Templars or their successors built Oak Island structures, they came from a tradition that embedded meaning in architecture. Gothic cathedrals encode theological messages in their floor plans. Masonic lodges arrange their spaces according to symbolic geometry. The idea that a secret order would encode retrieval instructions into the landscape of a hidden site is not speculation. it is consistent with how they operated in every other domain. The surface features of Oak Island may be a map, not a map drawn on paper, but a map written in stone and earth, legible only to someone who holds the key, the system of measurement, the symbolic vocabulary, the initiatic knowledge that connects the markers to whatever lies below. If this is true, then the money pit was never meant to be opened by brute force. Every drill, every pump, every excavation team has been trying to break a lock instead of finding the key. And the key may have been visible the entire time, set into boulders on the surface of the island, waiting for someone who understands what the builders understood. No modern investigator has fully decoded the pattern. The island still holds its shape. The question is whether the knowledge required to read it still exists somewhere in some archive or tradition that has not yet been connected to this place. In 2001, a researcher named Barbara Frail discovered a document in the Vatican secret archives that had been misfiled for nearly 700 years. It was called the Chinon Parchment, dated 1308, and it contained something extraordinary. Pope Clement V, the same pope who had publicly dissolved the Templar order under pressure from Philip IV, had privately absolved the Templars of all charges of heresy. The confession and the condemnation had been political theater. The church itself, in secret, had cleared the order. The Chinon Parchment rewrites the destruction of the Templars. It was not a religious purification. It was a political assassination coordinated between a desperate king and a compromised pope. The Templars were destroyed not because they were heretics, but because they were too powerful, too wealthy, and too independent to be tolerated by a monarchy drowning in debt. But the existence of the Chinon Parchment raises a deeper question. If this document was misfiled, what else remains buried in the Vatican archives? The archive contains an estimated 53 miles of shelving. Portions remain restricted. Access is granted selectively. And the Templar files, though partially open to scholars in recent decades, have never been released in full. There are references in Vatican correspondence to Templar holdings in the Atlantic. There are oblique mentions of maritime operations that extended beyond the Mediterranean. There are inventories of seized properties that list items marked as transferred rather than confiscated, a distinction that implies someone received them, someone whose identity was never recorded in the public file. The Vatican may not know what is buried on Oak Island, but it may know more than it has disclosed about what the Templars were doing in the Atlantic in the years before and after their dissolution. That knowledge, if it exists, sits somewhere in 53 miles of shelving, and no one outside those walls has been given permission to look for it. The connection between the Knights Templar and Freemasonry is one of the most debated subjects in the study of secret societies. Mainstream historians generally argue that Freemasonry emerged from medieval stonemason guilds in the 16th and 17th centuries, and that any Templar connection is romantic mythology rather than documented lineage. But the documented record is more ambiguous than the dismissal suggests. In Scotland, where Templar properties and knowledge survived the dissolution more intact than anywhere else in Europe, the earliest Masonic lodges appeared in regions with the densest concentrations of former Templar estates. The rituals of Scottish Rite Freemasonry contain explicit references to the Temple of Solomon, to the loss of a sacred word, and to the persecution of a righteous brotherhood by an unjust king. These are Templar themes dressed in Masonic language. Whether the connection is direct transmission or cultural inheritance, the thread is visible, and it leads to Oak Island. Several of the earliest investors in Oak Island excavation companies were Freemasons. This is not speculation. Lodge records confirm their membership. The Onslow Company, the Truro Company, and later ventures all included men who belonged to lodges that practiced rites with Templar content. These were not casual associations. Freemasonry in 18th century Nova Scotia was a structured network of men with shared knowledge, shared obligations, and access to oral traditions that were not available to outsiders. The question is what those men knew. Did they dig on Oak Island because they heard a local legend about buried treasure and decided to invest on a gamble? Or did they dig because they had inherited through their Masonic networks a partial set of instructions, a fragment of a map, a whisper passed down through centuries of lodges that something had been buried on a small island in Mahone Bay by an order they were taught to revere? The first explanation is simpler. The second explains why they kept digging long after any rational investor would have walked away. There's a concept in forensic analysis that applies directly to Oak Island. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but a pattern of absence can itself become evidence. Consider what has disappeared. The inscribed stone from the money pit, gone. The parchment fragment from the 1849 drill operation, gone. The Templar fleet from La Rochelle, gone. The land records for Oak Island between 1620 and 1750, gone. The original annotations on French and Portuguese maps of Mahone Bay, gone. The full Templar archives in the Vatican, restricted. With the Zeno narrative's source documents, gone. Each of these disappearances has its own explanation. Stones get lost, parchment degrades, ships sink, archives burn, maps are corrected. But when every category of evidence pointing to the same island and the same historical group vanishes independently, the cumulative effect is no longer explicable by accident. A pattern of erasure is a pattern, and a pattern implies an agent. Someone or some succession of people across centuries has been remarkably effective at ensuring that no single piece of evidence survives long enough to connect the Templars definitively to Oak Island. This does not prove the Templars built the pit, but it proves that someone across an extraordinarily long span of time has been invested in making sure that proof never emerges. The skeptic says there is no evidence. The investigator says the evidence was there and was removed. And the question that separates those two positions is not about Oak Island at all. It is about whether you believe that a pattern of disappearance across 7 centuries targeting the same set of connections could occur by chance. If your answer is yes, then Oak Island is a curiosity. If your answer is no, then the absence itself is the most important artifact the island has produced. And unlike the inscribed stone and the parchment and the fleet, the absence cannot be made to vanish. It is the one piece of evidence that survives by the very act of its creation. The modern era of Oak Island exploration has brought technology the original builders could not have anticipated. Ground-penetrating radar, sonar imaging, spectral analysis of soil composition, and deep core drilling have all been deployed on the island in recent decades. The results have been quietly remarkable. Sonar scans have identified anomalies deep underground that are consistent with man-made chambers and passages. Metal detection equipment has registered signatures at depths that correspond with the reported location of the cement vault. And in the Smith's Cove area, excavations have recovered a small lead cross whose metallurgical composition was analyzed and found to be consistent with European smelting techniques from the 13th to 15th centuries. The cross is not stamped with a Templar seal. It bears no inscription. but its lead isotope ratios point to a European origin, and its age places it squarely within the Templar operational period. It was found not in the Money Pit itself, but in the Smith's Cove area, the same location as the flood tunnel drainage system. This raises a possibility that has been gaining traction among researchers in recent years. What if the Money Pit is not the vault? What if it is the decoy? The flood tunnels, the oak platforms, the inscribed stone, the engineered flooding, all of it designed to attract attention, absorb effort, and destroy excavations, while the actual repository sits elsewhere on the island, undisturbed, untouched, waiting beneath ground that no one has thought to dig because everyone has been focused on the obvious target. The lead cross was found away from the pit. The Nolan Cross boulders mark a pattern that extends across the island. The stone triangle points inward, but not necessarily toward the Money Pit. If the builders were as sophisticated as the engineering suggests, then misdirection would have been a central element of their design. And for 200 years, it has worked. Every expedition has gone straight for the pit. The island may have been telling a different story the entire time. Step back from the details for a moment. Forget the Templars. Forget the flood tunnels. Forget the theories and the deaths and the centuries of failed excavation. Look at what is actually known, stripped to its essentials. Someone at some point before 1795 constructed one of the most sophisticated underground engineering projects in the pre-industrial Western Hemisphere. They built it on a small, uninhabited island. They equipped it with self-defending flood mechanisms. They sealed a chamber at extreme depth with hydraulic cement. They imported materials from thousands of miles away. They left geometric markers on the surface that correspond to ancient systems of measurement. And then they erased every trace of their identity from the historical record. No name, no flag, no claim, no map. No letter, no confession, no boast, nothing. In an age when kings carved their names into every stone they laid, when explorers planted flags on every beach they touched, when orders and empires competed to be remembered, someone built an extraordinary thing and then chose to be forgotten. That choice is the deepest mystery on Oak Island. Not what was buried, not who buried it, but why the builders decided that their work must survive while their identity must not. Every generation that digs on Oak Island asks the same question the builders anticipated. What is down there, Nindis? And every generation fails for the same reason. They're asking the wrong question. The pit does not withhold its secret because the technology is insufficient. It withholds it because the builders designed a system that cannot be opened by force, only by knowledge. And the knowledge required is not geological or mechanical. It may be symbolic, it may be geometric, it may be doctrinal. Whatever it is, it was held by a group of people who are no longer here to share it. The island is not a puzzle that needs a stronger drill. It is a question that needs a better answer. 6 people have died on Oak Island. This is the fact that sits beneath every conversation about the pit, the treasure, the Templars, and the secret. 6 people went to the island looking for answers and did not come home. The legend says the island requires 7. You can dismiss this as superstition. You can call it the kind of dark folklore that accumulates around any site where tragedy repeats itself. You can note that the number 7 has no special mechanical relationship to the engineering of the pit, and that dead men do not unlock vaults. All of this is reasonable, and yet the legend persists. It persists not because people in Mahone Bay are superstitious, but because Oak Island has a way of making rational explanations feel insufficient. The pit was rational. The flood tunnels were rational. The erasure of records was rational. And yet the sum of all that rationality has produced something that feels like it belongs to an older, stranger logic, a logic where certain things cannot be taken without a price. Whether the seventh death is prophecy or metaphor, it has become part of the island's architecture as surely as the oak platforms and the stone drains. Every person who descends into a shaft on Oak Island carries the number with them. They do not speak of it often, but they know it. The money pit remains unbreached. The cement vault at 153 feet remains sealed. The chamber, if it exists, has not been opened. The Templar fleet, if it sailed to Nova Scotia, left nothing on the surface that names it. The Vatican files remain restricted. The inscribed stone is still missing. The parchment fragment is still gone, and somewhere beneath the soil of a small island in Mahone Bay, behind water and stone and the accumulated silence of 700 years, something waits. It has been waiting longer than any of us have been alive, and it shows no sign of surrendering its patience before we surrender ours.